Meherabad's work with the God Mad. In this brief video presentation, I will discuss some of the historical significance of Meherabad's work with the God Mad, work that he began in earnest in August 1936 in Rahuri in Maharashtra, India. I'll also suggest some speculations on the symbolic significance of this work. It's well known that Dr. William Donkin was an expert on Meherabad's work with the Mad and Musts, as documented in his book, The Wayfarers. This book and Bau Kalchuri's book, Lord Mayher, Volume 6, provide the basis for much of the historical content of our discussion. Meherabad's foreword to The Wayfarers, especially Part 1, The Difference Between Ordinary Madness and Must States, provides the basis for our speculations on the symbolic significance of Meherabad's work with the God Mad. Although technically the Mad Ashram was not formally disbanded until September 1940, Dr. Donkin felt that the main thrust of the work reached a crescendo when the Mad Ashram inmates performed the drama Raja Gopichand in the fall of 1938. After that time, Baba became focused on other projects, especially his travels on the famous Blue Bus tours, which began in December of 1938, as well as his growing and expanding must work. The period of 1936 to 1938, then, is in keeping with the period covered by these proceedings. By May 1936, Meher Baba had begun preparations to establish an ashram at Rahuri, a small village some 30 miles from Meherabad. As he said at the time, "Since Rahuri is between Meherabad and Nasik, I can conveniently go to either place from there. A small hut in Rahuri should be built for me." And so, a small piece of land was acquired there and huts were built for Baba and some of the men Mandali. The development of the Rahuri ashram was to usher in an entirely new phase of Meher Baba's life and work. Although he had contacted musts, mad, and other seekers previously, never had he applied himself so vigorously and directly to the service of the mad. When we look at Meher Baba's life in broad strokes, we can see that since the time of leaving Upasni Maharaj's ashram in Sikori in January of 1922, he had applied himself to a number of different projects. First, he gathered and trained his close disciples at both Manzili Mim and Meherabad. Then there was the period of establishing Meherabad and developing the many schools there, especially the Meher and Prem ashram schools. Following this period, Baba traveled to the West, Europe, and the USA, and began gathering and training his newfound disciples there. Now, just as the world was about to erupt into war, Meher Baba began working with men who were mad. This was not a must ashram, like those that Baba later established, but a mad ashram, specifically designated for working with ordinary men of deranged mental functioning. Though Baba's initial focus here was on the mad, it seems clear that this ashram was to mark the beginning point of his intense must work as well. As Dr. Donkin has observed, quote, "The Rahuri ashram was principally for mad people, ordinary insane men from the towns and villages of the surrounding country. There were a few genuine musts and a few god-mad, but the greater number were mere psychotics of one kind or another, with nothing spiritual about them. This ashram, although it stands apart from the later centers for musts, does, however, have one factor in common with them, and that is the nature of its external routine, and it is because of this similarity of the external work that Rahuri was, in a way, the starting point for the later work with musts." End of quote. In fact, although primarily made up of mad persons, there were several musts in the Rahuri ashram as well, including the great favorite Muhammad must. So what about this distinction then between the mad and the must? How did Meher Baba distinguish between these two categories? Many of us are familiar with the famous statement reported in The Wayfarers that Ramju Abdullah once heard Meher Baba say, which is, "Mind stopped is God, mind working is man, mind slowed down is must, mind working fast is mad. While this is certainly a useful and memorable way to remember the distinction between the mad and must states, Meher Baba had much more to say about the distinction between the two. One important point the Baba makes is in regard to the etiology of these states. As he says in his preface to the Wayfarers, quote, "In feeble-minded or mad persons, aberrations from the average pattern of responses and actions are the result of their mental incapacity to adhere to the ordinary ways of the world. Through inherent psychic weakness, their directive effort has come to an impasse, or has fizzled out. The cases of breakdown of the mind in ordinary madness are often due to aimlessness in life, as they are due to insufficiency or to an inadequacy of the available willpower or mental strength. There are usually many other contributory factors in such cases. Persons who find shelter in mental hospitals are generally those who have been subjected to unusual mental shock or strain. They lose their balance of mind due either to insufficient mental development or to the operation of physiological or psychic forces of disruption." End of quote. On the other hand, the origin of must states is described quite differently. When an individual decides that conventional life does not adequately address life's challenges, he or she may begin to experiment with their life firsthand, without recourse to established societal conventions. As Baba says, quote, "Ordinarily, such a person carries on new experimentation with the help of others whom he considers more advanced than himself, and, in rare cases, he has the advantage of direction by a perfect master. In such cases, his deviations from the average pattern of life are not very considerable. But if the experimentation proceeds without the help of available guidance and loses all moorings, the person may, in his own right and with his own understanding, take to unconventional patterns of life. Once the average pattern of mind is surrendered, it makes room for infinite varieties of self-created and provisional patterns of life and action. These patterns may deviate considerably from normality, and the ways of life that follow from such patterns may even seem to be insane, to the extent to which they deviate from the average mode of life. But they do not necessarily mean real insanity or even retrogression on the path of inner search. Such a person is often in his own individual way in earnest search of God or truth. Notice here that Baba equates the idea of God with the abstract idea of truth. Again, quote, "Such a person is often in his own individual way in earnest search of God or truth as the unfailing inward directive power. In and through his waywardness, there is a logic of his own, and all of his idiosyncrasies and aberrations can be understood only if they are viewed in the light of the inner motive power." End of quote. The must state, then, comes about as the result of a deliberate, proactive attempt by the individual to solve the challenges of life on his or her own. States of madness, on the other hand, result from a weak state of mind and a, quote, "mental incapacity to adhere to the ordinary ways of the world." End of quote. Such states may be exacerbated if one has, as Baba says, been subjected to unusual mental shock or strain. It is these mad ones, those exhibiting, quote, "mental incapacity to adhere to the ordinary ways of the world," upon whom Meher Baba focused his attention in the Mad Ashram at Rahuri and Meherabad. While his work with the mad was going on, Baba also began to pay special attention to the few musts who were housed in the Mad Ashram, especially Muhammad. Not only did Baba engage in special work with Muhammad, but in the fall of 1937, Baba, who was in France at the time, had Adi Kairani bring Muhammad to France by ship. This was certainly a momentous spiritual event for the Avatar to bring one of his favorite musts from India to Europe on the eve of a cataclysmic world war. Many have speculated about what that might have meant for Baba's later work with Muhammad during the war years. Adi had many entertaining, though harrowing, stories of his sojourn with the great must, who was generally wreaking havoc on board the ship. At first, The authorities refused to even allow Muhammad on board, but they finally relented when Adi assured them that Muhammad was being brought to France for treatment. Now, in regard to treatment, what exactly was the treatment that Baba gave to the mad and musts in the mad ashram? According to Dr. Donkin, quote, Baba's work, his visible and external work, was to shave, bathe, clothe, and feed each inmate as soon as he arrived, and each day to scour the ashram latrine and to bathe and sit in seclusion with a certain number of the old inmates. In this way, he would throw every ounce of energy into doing every sort of menial task, and was, in fact, master of all and servant of all. There was perhaps nothing unusual in ministering faithfully to the physical needs of such people, but Baba's work did not stop there, and indeed that side of it was the least important of all. What Baba did was to give the human and divine touch to the most uninspiring chores. Like the fragrance of a garden by night, the essence of his selfless love permeated the darkness of these broken and distorted minds. The men came to feel this and, in their own queer ways, would reciprocate the love that Baba gave them, and many came to worship him as a divine incarnation. These two factors of Baba's selfless service and superhuman love were sufficiently evident for a casual observer to sense their influence, but, in addition, there has always been an impression amongst Baba's disciples that the ultimate purpose of his work with musts, advanced souls, and the mad is a spiritual one, whose application stretches far beyond the limits of his external and visible labors. It is, unfortunately, not possible to corroborate this hypothesis because all that Baba says about his work with the god-mad and musts is that he loves them and they love him, that he helps them and they help him. End of quote. At the close of his chapter on the Rahuri ashram, Dr. Donkin again speculates on the spiritual significance of Meher Baba's work with the mad at Rahuri. While discussing the question of the effectiveness of Meher Baba's treatment of the mad in the ashram, Dr. Donkin says, quote, I get the impression, which at its best is but an intuition, that Baba used these madmen as unconscious participants in the genesis of a spiritual reality whose ultimate value will far outweigh the transient external benefits of their sojourn with him. End of quote. While I, of course, agree with Dr. Donkin's assessment, I would also like to add some speculations on the symbolic importance of Meher Baba's work with the mad and musts. In previous presentations, I've put forth my conviction that, in addition to whatever spiritual significance Baba's work with the mad and musts might have, Meher Baba's work as an active agent of change in the physical world transmits a symbolic significance that can be seen and understood in the gross physical world by those of ordinary gross consciousness. It is well documented that symbols act as carriers of psychological energy. Symbols are capable of transmitting psychological energy in a way that can trigger powerful psychological transformations. This is true on the gross physical level, leaving aside any metaphysical questions of hidden spiritual significance. However, symbols can also represent that which is unseen and not yet understood. The Merriam-Webster Dictionary defines a symbol as, quote, something that stands for or suggests something else by reason of relationship, association, convention, or accidental resemblance, especially a visible sign of something invisible. When I use the word symbol or symbolic here, I'm using it in the sense of a visible sign of something invisible. More than once, Meher Baba has explicitly referred to the symbolic role played by the spiritual master. Here are two examples from the discourses. Quote, a disciple should realize from the very beginning, the master only requires that the disciple should realize his own higher self. In fact, the master symbolizes this higher self of the disciple and is none other than this higher self, which is the same one reality in all. So, allegiance to the master is only another form of allegiance to one's higher self. End of quote. In another discourse, Meher Baba says the following, since the master is for the aspirant, a symbol of the Supreme Self in all, the problem of true adjustment to the Master appears to him to be the same as realizing his own inner divinity and arriving at true adjustment with all other forms of the Supreme Self." End of quote. It is my conviction that Meher Baba's work with the mad and musts represents for the aspirant not only the ideal of selfless love and service to which each of us might aspire, but he also symbolically represents how we might gently, lovingly, and compassionately treat and respond to our own wounded lower selves, or, in the case of the musts, our own wounded higher selves. If Meher Baba symbolically represents our best, highest selves, as he clearly asserts in the discourses just quoted, then it follows that he is the ideal role model for us on many levels. Many of us have found ourselves working on parts of ourselves that, as Baba has described the mad persons, quote, have been subjected to unusual mental shock or strain, end of quote, or have lost, quote, their balance of mind due either to insufficient mental development or to the operation of physiological or psychic forces of disruption, end of quote. These are the parts of ourselves that, as Baba has said of the mad, have been unable to, quote, adhere to the ordinary ways of the world, end of quote, the parts of ourselves whose, quote, directive effort has come to an impasse or has fizzled out, end of quote. Just as society tends to chastise and cast out those members of the social group who, due to severe shock or trauma, unhappy upbringings, etc., have become unable to adhere to societal norms, we, as individuals, sometimes cast out and refuse to face parts of ourselves that we have been unable to understand and to integrate. Meher Baba's work with the mad provides us with an astonishingly beautiful, symbolic example of how such people and such parts of ourselves might be accepted, loved, and protected. As Dr. Donkin has said, quote, like the fragrance of a garden by night, the essence of his selfless love permeated the darkness of these broken and distorted minds. There may be those who question the spiritual importance of nurturing and bringing such unconscious parts of ourselves into consciousness. However, Meher Baba has been precisely clear on this point. As he says in his discourse on God and the individual, quote, "We have seen that the possible field of consciousness is limited by the sanskaras. This limitation creates a division of the human psyche into two parts. One part falls within the range of consciousness, and the other part falls beyond it. The unconscious part, in its full extent, is identical with the power which is behind matter. It is referred to as God by the Orthodox religions. The ultimate reality, which is symbolically represented through such concepts, can be known fully only by bringing the unconscious into consciousness." End of quote. Baba is saying very clearly here that God can only be known by bringing the unconscious into consciousness. He elaborates on this further in terms of inner conflicts in his discourse on the nature of the ego and its transformation, when he says, quote, "The elimination of conflict is possible only through conscious control over the psychic forces in the subconscious." End of quote. Well, we've been speculating here on the symbolic significance of Meher Baba's work with the mad, but what about the musts? Likewise, Baba's work with the musts can be seen as symbolic of how we might understand and work with parts of ourselves that, with the best of intentions, have somehow missed the mark and gone off onto side roads and dead ends. As we've noted, the must state comes about as the result of a deliberate, proactive attempt by the individual to solve the challenges of life on his or her own. As Baba says, quote, "Once the average pattern of life is surrendered, it makes room for infinite varieties of self-created and provisional patterns of life and action. These patterns may deviate considerably from normality, and the ways of life that follow from such patterns may even seem to be insane, to the extent to which they deviate from the average mode of life. Now, just as an aside, we don't need to comment on how many Baba lovers we may know whose lives, quote, deviate considerably from normality. Baba goes on to say that these deviant patterns, quote, do not necessarily mean real insanity or even retrogression on the path of inner search. Such a person is often, in his own individual way, in earnest search of God or truth as the unfailing inward directive power. In and through his waywardness there is a logic of his own, and all his idiosyncrasies and aberrations can be understood only if they are viewed in the light of the inner motive power. End of quote. It is likely that none of us are musts, and yet who among us who follows Meher Baba does not resonate with the idea that we have gone our own way and have followed a logic of our own? When we can learn to understand our own idiosyncrasies and the idiosyncrasies of those we meet, as Baba says, quote, in the light of the inner motive power, end of quote, we may begin to see and think of ourselves and others very differently. Well, however we may understand the possible symbolic significance of Meher Baba's work with the musts and the mad, it should be clear to even the meanest casual observer that Meher Baba's tireless efforts to love, serve, and cater to these wayward children of God is a stunning achievement of love on the human level. Many of us have heard Erich, Adi, Padri, Bao, and others recount tales of journeys, of sleepless nights, hundreds of miles, and countless hardships and deprivations, just so that Meher Baba might spend a few moments or hours showering these wayward souls with love and attention. But these long journeys came later. During the period of the Mad Ashram, the caretaking of the Mad took place within the confines of the ashram. Although Meher Baba continued to travel and the ashram was moved from Rahuri to Meherabad, the inmates of the Mad Ashram were never neglected. The care provided to them by their caretakers was consistently loving and thoughtful until Baba returned to pick up his work with them once again. As Dawkins says, quote, one should not assume that during these phases of Baba's absence, the Mad Ashram was in any way neglected, for the daily routine was carried out with scrupulous attention to all Baba's detailed instructions. In April of 1937, Baba had the Mad Ashram moved from Rahuri to Meherabad. As mentioned earlier, Baba went to France from August to November of 1937. He also made trips to Gujarat and Panchgani. When he returned from Panchgani in June of 1938, however, activities at the ashram heightened and built to a climax with the performance by the all-mad cast of the play Raja Gopichand. After this performance, about one half of the inmates of the Mad Ashram were sent back to their homes, and Baba began preparations for the Blue Bus tours. Now, the story of Raja Gopichand is a famous and touching tale of a king who renounces his throne in order to become a yogi and a seeker of God. In his book The Wayfarers, Dr. Donkin describes the performance of the play performed by the inmates of the Mad Ashram on September 25th, 1938, as he says, quote, the drama was the classical tale of Raja Gopichand, and the principal roles were played by the Mad. The chief credit for instilling into these men's disorganized minds their parts, their cues, their gestures, their positions on the stage, and so on, must be laid at the feet of Pleader, who coaxed and cudgeled each actor into shape with an exquisite patience. Costumes and scenery were hired from a theatrical company, and the final performance was witnessed by a considerable audience, for Baba invited many disciples from Ahmednagar, Nasik, Pune, and even Bombay to come to Meherabad for the occasion. Though not comparable with professional standards, the performance was an unqualified success. End of quote. As a boy of 8 years old, Merwan Jesawala, brother of Erich Jesawala, was present at the performance of Raja Gopichand at the Mad Ashram. In an interview with Ward Parks in June of 1994, Merwan reminisced about his experience of this performance at the Mad Ashram.
This Raja Gopichand?
Yes, so the Gopichand Raja was performed and it was successfully performed.
So,
somehow.
so the ashram inmates played the major roles also? Did they?
No, it's only the mad ashram people.
I mean to say the mad ashram?
Yeah, everything.
Like the Raja, they played that?
I don't know the different things.
Wow.
I wasn't sitting in the audience much of the time. I was moving around. Being a small child, I would see what's going on here. So I was out once and I saw this one of the mad people rushing out and people grabbing him. That was most indelibly impressed upon me. I was so frightened to see the man being dragged back on the stage. And they had these big tongs, they are called chumchumiyas. They used to perform these rites, and he had those in his hands. And he was all dressed in saffron robes with big hair matted, and he looked quite formidable with those big long tongs in his hand, and they catching him hold.
And somehow they got him back into
Then he went back and he was performing all right. And there was a big applause at the end of the play. And every manly hide must have sighed a sigh of relief. Must have heaved a sigh of relief.
Do you remember how did Baba seem to like play?
Yeah, I don't remember that, but he was very pleased with the effort, it seems.
Yeah.
That was the last thing, and I think soon thereafter the ashram was wound up, the inmates were sent off, and Baba was preparing for the blue bus journeys.
It is interesting to note that just as the activities of the Mad Ashram were reaching a climax, events on the world stage were also developing in dramatic ways. Only a few days after the performance of Raja Gopichand, on September 30th, 1938, Adolf Hitler scored an important diplomatic victory with the signing of the famous Munich Pact. He subsequently stepped up many of his aggressive military activities, which led directly to the commencement of World War II in 1939. Although it is true that Meher Baba's work with the inmates of the Mad Ashram continued until 1940, at which time the Mad Ashram was permanently disbanded, as Merwan has pointed out, after the performance of Raja Gopichand, Baba began preparing for what came to be known as the Blue Bus Tours, which began in December of 1938. After the performance of Raja Gopichand, Baba put less and less emphasis on his work with the Mad, and more emphasis on his work with the musts. Well, there will be much more to say about Meher Baba's work with the musts in future presentations. For now, our speculations here on the spiritual and symbolic significance of Meher Baba's work with the Mad and musts must remain, of course, merely speculations. As Dr. Donkin has observed, quote, all that Baba says about his work with the God Mad and musts is that he loves them and they love him, that he helps them and they help him.